Oh no. I used to work for a small startup company. I'm not even really sure what I did because I was just a security person. But I always thought it was a little strange that they even felt they needed a security guard. The office was really small and looked somewhat unimportant, like any other office. It made my job easy though, because I didn't have to parade around multiple floors all night. I got in at 9 and turned on the security alarm systems, then headed to the little security room that had all the camera screens set up. The place only had outdoor cameras, which were really low quality. The first couple hours went by slowly, with the usual nothing going on. Sometime around 1 a.m. though, I heard what sounded like a latch clicking shut. I sat there confused for a moment, then stood up and opened the door to the hallway. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it. There were only 3 doors down the hallway, and each one was closed. I walked over to each door, opening them and briefly looking around. The rooms were layered with a bunch of office desks, but from what I could see, it was all normal. By now, it had been long enough for me to start wondering if the sound I heard was actually what I thought it was. Maybe I just didn't hear it right. After all, the security systems should have triggered an alarm if someone had opened one of the main doors to get inside. So I went back to the room, this time leaving the door open to the hallway, so if I heard it again, it'd be more clear. Then I sat back and continued monitoring the cameras. I checked the footage from the previous few minutes, just to see if I missed anything, but I didn't see anything at all. No movement outside the building. Another 20 minutes passed. I think by then, I pretty much came to terms that whatever I heard was nothing, as I was back to not paying as much attention. Then, a sound echoed down the hallway. It was faint. The door opening slowly. I jumped up from my chair and walked into the hallway, not believing what I heard. I immediately saw one of the doors was cracked open. Knowing that none of the alarms went off and nothing had shown up on the cameras, I was extremely confused. I was sure that nobody could be in here. I crept over and opened the door a little further, revealing the dark office room. I took a few steps inside, but didn't hear or see anything. So I started to walk further in, going past each office desk. Then, as I got to the back of the room, I saw the slightest movement on one of the walls, like a shadow or something, before I turned my head and instantly locked eyes with a person crouched underneath one of the desks. There was a man with black hair and large dark circles under his eyes. He had a look of both fear and anger, like he was both mad and worried that I'd found him. The instant we saw each other though, he started getting up. I had no idea if he had any kind of weapons on him, so I took no chances and started running for my life. I went into the hallway and out the front doors, which triggered the security alarms and automatically notified the police. I went a safe distance away, then tried to watch the front doors as I waited for the officers to show up. It only took about 30 seconds before the doors swung open and the man came running out. He ran around to the other side of the building, and from there I lost sight of him. When officers got there, we downloaded the footage from the whole night, but nowhere in it did we see the man enter the building. So we don't know when or even how they got in. Obviously, the other question is why they broke in. After discussing it with the company, they said they knew nothing about it and didn't find anything missing. I have a hunch that they might have known more than they let on though. Hiring security for their tiny office isn't normal unless you have a reason to. I think it might have actually been an old employee that they knew was a little unhinged. Anyway, I stayed there for another few months, then called it quits for a better job. I never found out anything else about what happened that night. This was during our school's winter break. It was the day after Christmas, and I had a part-time job at our town's pizza shop. This place was pretty popular, and it felt like pretty much every kid at my school also worked there. Being so young though, every paycheck made me feel like I was rich, so I always agreed to work whenever they needed me. I thought it wouldn't be that busy this day, because everyone would be staying home with their families still. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Around dinner time, all the indoor seats were taken up, and we were getting tons of delivery orders. My job was to greet and seat people, or do deliveries if needed. Around 8, my manager told me to start taking deliveries. I did a quick one, then picked up another from the kitchen and got back on the road. It was a single pizza to be delivered at a home 20 minutes away. At least the roads weren't busy. They were actually really dead, like barely anyone was outside, which was a very odd change of atmosphere from being inside the pizza shop. Snow was lightly falling down, really only visible under the streetlights. It was so peaceful, I actually drove the speed limit and tried to soak it in, knowing what waited for me back at work. Eventually I got to the customer's house though. It wasn't really in a neighborhood. It was directly off the side of the road, with its own long gravel road leading up to it. The house was surrounded by snow-covered trees and had over-the-top Christmas decorations all over their house and front yard. They hadn't plowed their driveway though, which made it difficult to find a place to park without getting stuck. I did the best I could, then got out with their order. One thing I noticed when walking up to their house was that while all the outdoor lights and decorations were turned on, not a single light inside was on, at least from what I could see from the front of the house. But as I walked closer, I realized there were shoe prints in the snow going up to the front. I figured it was the owner, obviously. When I got up to the porch though, the shoe prints didn't go up to the door. They went around to the side of the porch. I thought that was weird, but hey, it was none of my business anyway. I knocked on the door. It was pretty cold out there, so after 30 seconds, I knocked again. It was quiet outside, just the low breeze and falling snow, and yet I still heard nothing inside the house. I double-checked the receipt to make sure I needed the payment, then knocked for a third time. I mean, the shoe prints in the snow were fresh, so they had to be home. Getting frustrated and starting to shiver, I knocked one last time, very loudly, probably shaking the whole house. Still, nobody answered. After that, I gave up. I left and went back to my car, getting in and trying to turn it on, but it wouldn't start. The engine kept stalling. I swore under my breath as I tried relentlessly to get it going, only getting more frustrated by the second, and my hands getting colder and colder. Then I happened to glance up and saw a person standing outside the house. They were completely bundled up, boots, jacket, snow pants, everything. I got out of my car. "Hey, did you order the pizza? I've been out here knocking on your door for 5 minutes." They didn't say anything, but began walking toward me. It took me a few seconds to realize something wasn't right, and I got back in my car. The way they kept their pace, not hurrying or anything, gave me the impression that they knew I couldn't leave. And that's when I started to panic. I began dialing 911 as they approached my window. Just when the officer asked what my emergency was, they started speaking. He had a low, deep voice and kept asking if I needed help. How the hell would he know that? That only confirmed my suspicions. I told the officer what I could and how to get where I was. The man outside started getting impatient, moving faster and looking around like he was trying to find a way in. It was absolutely terrifying, sitting helplessly in my tiny car with this likely dangerous man outside and only a thin window between us. I kept trying to get the engine running, praying for it to work. He then started reaching into his pockets, looking for something, but I could see the panic in his face when he couldn't find whatever he was looking for. He then punched the window a few times, trying to break it, before running back to the side of the house like he was going to get something. 2 minutes passed as I sat there trying to decide whether to wait for the cops or leave my car and try to make a run for it. Then I saw the flickering blue and red lights in my mirror. And at the same time, the man showed up on the side of the house, holding something in his right hand. He saw the lights and instantly took off. I'm sure it doesn't need too much explaining as to what happened that night, but that man didn't live there. The owners were gone for the holidays, but the man had plugged in their decorations in the outlet outside the house to make it look like they were home. While I was on the porch, he tampered with something outside my car to keep it from turning on. I'm not a car guy, so honestly I didn't really understand it. Likely the man planned to kidnap me, but out of sheer luck, he must have dropped his knife or whatever tool he needed to break the window. So that's what he ran back to get. Nothing's for certain, of course, but that seems like the most likely case. Anyway, I stopped doing deliveries after that night. It was a pretty typical night in the middle of March. I worked at a gas station at the time. Usually I did afternoon shifts, but every once in a while I'd cover for someone's overnight shift. I had gotten a call in the morning to come in from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., all of which would count as overtime, so I quickly agreed. I got in and took over for the manager, then sat behind the front counter. It was pouring outside, and supposedly a big storm was gonna roll in later. Seemed to keep most people at home because the gas station was dead. After sitting inside for an hour, I threw on my raincoat and ran outside to prepare the station for the storm. There were a bunch of loose things hanging around the pumps that needed to be brought inside. I started picking them up and running back and forth to drop them off, and as I was grabbing the last few, I noticed a man not too far away from the gas station. He was on the side of the street, pacing around and getting drenched by the rain. It was very unusual, though it looked like he was probably just waiting for a ride. I finished up and headed inside. 2 hours later, thunder started rumbling in the distance, and soon after, heavy winds and even harsher rain came swooping in. I knew it would be bad, but this was insane. The wind smacking against the sides of the building was actually making the whole room shake. And at one point, I even thought the front doors were going to snap off the hinges because they swung open so fast. I hurried over and secured the bolt lock to keep them in place, then moved toward the back of the building and into the storage room, away from all the windows. And I just waited. I want to say it was maybe 30 minutes after the storm has started. I was still in the back of the building when, through all the harsh noises, I heard a muffled sound. It wasn't until I heard it multiple times that I realized it was someone banging on the front doors. I left the storage room and looked down the sales floor. There was someone outside, looking in at me and hitting the doors repeatedly. I hurried over and unlocked it, thinking he was in trouble and needed help. He quickly ran inside, and I closed and locked the doors behind him. The man was soaking wet and had pools of water draining from his jacket and spilling onto the floor. He didn't stop to thank me or explain himself. He just kept walking, back and forth, pacing across the floor. It was the same man I'd seen outside earlier. Had he been out there the whole time? It had been over 2 hours since I'd seen him. I tried asking if he was okay and if I needed to call for help, but the man just kept pacing the floor with this blank, hollow look in his eyes. After watching him for a minute, I got really uncomfortable and started to walk to the front desk to call the police. As I picked up the phone though, his eyes snapped at me and he stopped walking. It was then, as we looked at each other, that I noticed his hands were cut, like right on the knuckles. They were bloody and bruised. I caught myself looking for too long, and by the time I looked back up at the man's eyes, I could tell he was pissed. "Don't," he said, clearly talking about me using the phone. I wasn't trying to test him, so I lowered the phone. There were a couple seconds where he just stared at me, like he was thinking about whether or not to do something. But then he turned and continued to pace the floor. The storm picked up outside, chaotically shaking the building and adding to the horror of whatever was happening. I tried to think out all my options as this maniac walked around just feet from me. I could try running, but I'd have to get the door unlocked and outrun him in the storm, which seemed really risky. I could also try calling the cops and hope he just leaves, but that was also risky. Funnily enough, I ended up choosing probably the most risky option, which was to do nothing and just wait. I stood there and watched him for, 20 minutes at least. At any point, he could have just snapped and ended me, but he didn't. After those 20 minutes, he gave me one last look, then walked over to the door, slid the bolt lock over, and walked out into the storm. I immediately called the police. I'm not sure if it was just because of the storm, or because they didn't think it was urgent enough, but it took over a half hour for a cop to show up. By then, whoever the hell that man was gone. They never found him. When the storm finally passed on the following day, there was a report filed for a missing woman. She never returned home from work that night after leaving the office at 11 p.m. Maybe I'm just connecting completely different things, but the man had clear signs of having attacked someone with blood and bruises on his knuckles, and the timeline seems to add up. Again, it's all just theories, but whatever I was in the middle of that night, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Last fall, I turned 16 and started my first job at a really small pizza place in my town. It was a family-owned shop with only 5 or 6 people working there. I only got the job because my best friend also worked there. I was the delivery driver though, and I only worked during the later hours since I had school during the day. It was around my 3rd week on the job that this happened. The night was pretty regular. It was slow, both for deliveries and dining. It was slightly cold out too, which kept most people at home. Around 11 though, a call came in. My friend picked up the phone and put the order in. It was for a small pizza and a soda, so they quickly made it and I hit the road to deliver it. The address wasn't too far, just 8 minutes away, but when I pulled onto the street, I immediately hit a pothole and realized that the whole street was cracked and full of potholes. It looked torn apart and completely uncared for. Our town wasn't exactly the nicest, but this was still far worse than most other places. I carefully drove down, avoiding any potholes I could see, until I made it to the address. It was a 2-story wooden house. The house itself looked just as old and uncared for as the street. But strangely, the yard was full of fresh flowers and plants that clearly had been tended to. I parked at the bottom of the driveway and grabbed the pizza and soda, then walked up to the front door. The wooden steps to the porch felt like they were going to give out, and I got a weird sense of something unsettling. I glanced back at my car, seeing the dense woods behind it and realizing how isolated this place felt. I knocked on the door. Right after knocking, I could hear movement inside the house, and floorboards started creaking. It was soft though, like they were walking lightly and slowly, but I could hear the creaking get closer and closer to the other side of the door until they were right behind it. I prepared myself for them to open the door by smiling and holding out the pizza, but they never opened it. After 10 seconds, I started getting uncomfortable. "Hello? I'm the pizza guy, just delivering your order." There was no response and no other sounds from inside. I could feel something off, so I backed up and walked off the porch. I was still a little hesitant about fully leaving without them paying though. I took one look back, and when I did, I physically felt my body shudder. There was a man standing by the side of the house, staring right at me, looking like he was walking toward me, and I'd only just stopped once I saw him. He looked old and skinny, but had an eerie look in his eyes. I hurried back into my car, and the man didn't say a word and just watched me. I pulled out of there and drove back to the pizza shop. I didn't know what that was. My friend thought it might have been some kind of prank, but that man looked like he was way too old to be pulling something like that. I'm just glad I left when I did, because I don't know what would have happened if that man made it to the porch before I got out. This was only a month ago. It was late September, and where I'm at, we were having a lot of rain. Pretty much every day, it was pouring down. I work as an outdoor security guard for a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, so rain doesn't exactly make my job any more enjoyable. Luckily, the company I work for lets me stay inside on rainy nights, but it always made the shift go by a lot slower. Instead of getting to roam around outside the building, I just had to stand by the glass entrance doors and watch for anything. Anyway, this night I got in at 9, locking up the place after all the employees left. It was pouring outside, so I stayed in and stood by the door, and honestly just tried to stay awake. There was nothing to see except rain and the occasional thunder and lightning. A few hours went by. During that time, I just leaned against the wall and made a few trips to the bathroom. But then, as I stood by the entrance doors, fighting to stay awake, there was a deep, creaking thud. It echoed through the whole warehouse. It sounded like bending metal, or maybe a heavy metal door scraping open. It was enough to make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I was sure it was nothing, and just a creepy sound because of the circumstances, but it was kind of my job to check on these things, so I walked down the hallway and looked through each of the corridors. I'd never actually explored much of the warehouse since I was usually outside. All I knew of was the one main hallway that had 5 or 6 corridors branching from it, leading to large open warehouse areas. I looked down each of these until I got to the last one. At the end, the door was cracked open. I felt a chill run through me, although I still didn't know if it was already opened or not. I walked over and opened it further. The whole room was dark. Hello, hello. My voice echoed through the otherwise silent warehouse. After a few seconds, I started to step back and close the door until I heard something in front of me. It was a voice. It sounded like a man, either mumbling or softly laughing, somewhere in the darkness near the tall shelving units. "Is someone there? What the hell are you doing here?" I called out. "Come here." he said something softly. "What?" "Come here," he said a little louder. Still, I couldn't see anything at all. After a couple more seconds, I said "fuck this" and closed the door. I used my radio to contact the police and left the building through the front. 5 minutes later, they showed up and walked through the building. They came out alone. Security tapes were reviewed, showing what looked like a 50-year-old man with a dark jacket slipping in through a gap in one of the back garages. From there, he made his way into the warehouse room, where I heard him in. And disturbingly, on the footage, it looked like he was holding some kind of knife. He made his exit soon after I left. We don't know why he broke in, or what exactly he was trying to do by telling me to come into the warehouse. It might sound weak of me, but I quit after that and took up a day job instead. Well, 4 years ago, in late October, I picked up a new job at a gas station. My friends were throwing a big Halloween party on the 31st, but because of when I got hired, I didn't have any vacation time, so unfortunately I had to work that night. At least I had most of the day to hand out candy and watch some movies though. I went into work at 8. The streets were pretty quiet, at least of cars, since kids were running around trick-or-treating, so I hoped the gas station wouldn't be busy. Thankfully, I got what I wished for. Only a couple dozen cars came in my first hour, and once it got closer to 10, even less were coming by. Even the roads weren't busy. I kept seeing a police car patrolling the road every 15 minutes, but aside from that, it was dead outside. I was fine with it being slow, but scrolling through my phone and seeing everyone else having fun on Halloween night was a little depressing, so I grabbed some boxes from the back of stuff to refill on the shelves. Another little while passed, and as my back was to the front door, I heard the little bell go off. I turned around and saw 3 men walking into the shop. They were all wearing Halloween costumes, like full costumes with masks and everything. One of them was dressed up as Michael Myers, but the other 2 I didn't recognize, probably some other typical Halloween characters. I could tell immediately they weren't kids though. They were grown adults. One of them even had a long beard sticking out from under the mask and had tattoos going up his neck. I greeted them, but aside from a quick glance, they didn't acknowledge me. Maybe they were just trying to be in character or something. I don't know, but it was already weird that they kept the masks on. I left the aisle and went around to the checkout counter while I waited for them to grab what they needed. I noticed there weren't any cars outside though, which explained why I didn't hear them pull in. I watched them look around for a minute at the candy aisle. Then they picked up a bag of Dum Dum lollipops and tossed them on the counter. "Find everything you needed." They didn't say anything. I rang it up and told them the total. They paid in cash. As I was doing the transaction though, I couldn't help but notice one of them in the back staring at me. Through the mask, I could only see his eyes, but they were locked on me and looked frustrated or angry or something. It made me really uncomfortable. I finished up and told them to have a good night. There was a pause though, before one of the men walked up to the front door and pulled down the bolt lock. My stomach dropped. The one that was staring at me then immediately came around the counter and shoved me onto the ground. I tried to stay calm and told them to take the money and that I wouldn't stop them. However, the other man walked around the counter and right past the register. They weren't here for the money. He forced zip ties around my hands and lifted me onto my feet. I was completely helpless as they dragged me through the store, and after briefly checking outside, they rushed me out the entrance. It was only as they dragged me toward the side of the building that I noticed an old car sitting in the grass outside the parking lot. As we reached the edge of the parking lot though, a sudden glaring light came over top us. It was a police car pulling into the lot. The three men dropped me on the pavement and sprinted into their car. I don't know if it just was that their car wouldn't start, or they gave up, or what, but the officers were able to get them before they got away. Backup showed up not even 30 seconds later. I guess what happened was earlier in the night, the police got a report of three men in costumes offering kids candy on the sidewalks and trying to lead them away from houses. That's why I kept seeing a patrol car circling the area. What they wanted to do with me, or any of the kids, isn't for sure, as none of the men confessed anything. It almost makes me glad that everything happened the way it did though, because if I'd sold them that candy and heard later on that it was used to kidnap kids with, I probably would have felt a ton of guilt. Thankfully, it didn't have to go that way. I was on my way to deliver an order from the sandwich shop I worked for. It was a quiet night, around 11 or so. I had my music playing in my car, and I was just running through the motions of the delivery. On my way to their neighborhood, I pulled up to a red light. There was nobody else at the intersection, but for some reason, the light stayed red for what felt like an abnormal amount of time. As I sat there and stared at the light, waiting for it to change, a car pulled up beside me. I only glanced over for a second, not wanting to make that awkward eye contact, but their windows were heavily tinted, like definitely more than what was legal, as I couldn't see a single thing through them. The car itself was black as well, maybe an old Toyota or something. I can't really pinpoint what it was, but I got a really uneasy feeling about them. It could have just been that we were the only two on the road. I'm really not sure. Eventually the light turned green and I started going. I didn't get very far though, before noticing they hadn't moved. They were still parked at the intersection. Once I got further down the road, I shrugged it off and just thought it was weird and nothing else. A couple minutes later, I pulled off into the section of housing that the delivery was in. I'd say neighborhood, but it wasn't really a neighborhood. It was just a line of 10 or so houses leading to a dead end. Something about it seemed really off-putting. Of all the houses on the street, not a single one had a light on. I 100% would have thought these places were abandoned, if not for the fact that the houses themselves looked really nice. They looked like ordinary neighborhood homes, with not a single sign of anything wrong with them. I figured it had to just be a coincidence that every resident down the street had their lights off. Anyway, the address I had was for the second to last house. I pulled up and parked on the curb, getting out with the order and walking up to the door. I was hoping I'd at least see some sort of light coming through the windows of this house, because it was the one I was delivering to. But standing on the porch, I didn't see any light. Reluctantly, I knocked on the door. When I did, the door swung a bit from its hinges, like it wasn't properly shut or locked. Now this was even more odd. Sandwich delivery, anyone home? It was completely silent, no response, and not even the slightest sound from inside the house. I was gonna leave, but just to be sure I didn't miss anything, I cracked the door open a little further. I could see a hallway and a room. Both were empty of any furniture or decorations, not even a single picture on the wall. It only took a few seconds before dust started coming through the doorway too. I shut it and backed up from the porch. I was very confused and slightly worried. As I walked back down to my car though, I noticed something down the road. A few houses back, there was a small black car that wasn't there when I pulled in. Its headlights were off, and it was parked. Once I saw the tinted windows, I immediately recognized it. I felt my face go white, knowing this could not possibly be a coincidence at this point. I started to hurry to my car, but as I got just a few feet away from the road, I saw something move in the reflection of one of the windows. I wasn't sure what it was that I saw, but I stopped in place. I was standing near the passenger door, and through the window, my eyes fell on the back seat. It was dark, but there was something blocking the back window. It only took me about a second for me to realize what I saw. I turned and bolted back to the house. As I did, the back door to my car swung open, and a man in a black hoodie and black pants came running out. He didn't chase me though. He ran straight down to the road and into his car. I stayed on the porch, and with my heart pounding, I dialed 911. I probably could have gotten in my car and left at that point, but I was too scared to really think straight. Police arrived and immediately told me that this whole street was unoccupied, as the homes were new builds. Guess that explains why I thought they looked so nice and not abandoned. What I definitely didn't expect was to hear them say that they've had multiple reports this past week, very similar to mine. The guy would order something for delivery with a fake name and address, then follow the driver. What happened to me was the closest call of any of them, though. The guy had snuck inside my car, was waiting for me to get in, and maybe even drive away. Who knows what he was trying to do? Unfortunately, there haven't been any updates on finding him. Well, I was pretty young when this happened. I think 16 or 17. It was at my first job, which was just some trashy pizza place. They paid slightly more than other places, and I made extra from tips when I did deliveries, so I stayed there for a while. I don't remember too much about the beginning of my shift this night. I probably started at my regular time, around 6, then was scheduled until 12. But the whole first half of my shift went by like any other day. It was sometime around 10 that we got an order for delivery, so I packed it up and left to drop it off. The place was 15 minutes away in a small neighborhood. It took me a minute to find the house though, because all the trees were blocking the address numbers, and a lot of the homes had long driveways leading far from the road. Eventually I did find it after circling back a few times. I drove down the driveway and parked closer to the home. It was one of those large houses that looked like it was built forever ago. I got the food and walked up to the front porch. It was hard not to notice how quiet it was in this neighborhood. It felt like I was so far away from everything, especially with the trees everywhere. When I got up to the porch though, the front door was wide open. I'd seen a lot of people leave their doors cracked open before, but the way this one was fully open was a little bit excessive. Anyway, I walked over and knelt down to set the food inside the house, when a voice called out, "Hey, would you mind bringing the pizza in here? I'm just setting up the table." It was a man's voice, but they sounded friendly. I knew it was frowned on to enter someone's home while delivering, but honestly, it was a fairly normal request and usually didn't take more than a few extra seconds and typically secured a good tip. I stepped inside and walked down the hallway into the kitchen. I set the box on the table, but nobody else was in there. I'd just heard his voice only moments ago, and I never heard him walk anywhere else. I also noticed the house was extremely quiet, like no other sounds at all. I felt a shiver run through me, and as I decided to leave, his voice called out again, "Can you bring it in here, please?" His voice came from the other hallway connecting to the kitchen. There was a single door that was open, but whatever room was behind it was dark. There was no light on. It also sounded like his voice came from right behind the doorway, like he was standing just out of sight. After a few seconds, I turned around and fast walked back out the front door. I got in my car and drove back to work, and I never said a word about it. I thought I'd either get made fun of for being scared or for being stupid, so I just kept it to myself. Thinking back on it now though, there was definitely something up with that guy. Nothing about that encounter was normal. I'm just glad that at least I was smart enough to leave when I did, because there's really no saying what would have happened if I went into that room with him. Well, I was 20 and worked with my parents at a really small takeout restaurant. We specialized in to-go orders. I was in college at the time and was on a very hectic schedule, but my parents were kind enough to offer me a laid-back position just as a general worker, usually just working the to-go table or cleaning up the place after closing hours. This was during early December, and with finals coming up, I didn't have much time to work during the day, so I was taking up mostly late night shifts where I'd just clean for a few hours, then head home. One of the nights I was working, I noticed around an hour into my shift that a car was parked in the parking lot. The way our restaurant was laid out, it was a standalone shop with a tiny parking lot in front of it, so there was no crossover between other stores or businesses. I thought whoever parked there probably just didn't think anyone would care, and they were right, because I really didn't care. 20 or so minutes later, they left. However, the next night, around the same time, the car pulled into the parking lot again. The first time it was fine, because I thought it was just a one-time thing, but coming back again was strange. I walked up to the front of the building and looked out. It was an older gray sedan with dark windows. They didn't seem to be trying to hide or anything, because they were facing right at the building, and they kept their headlights on. I double-checked that the doors were locked before getting back to cleaning. It was hard not to feel like they were watching me through the giant glass front windows, but just like last time, they left not too long after. I finished up my work and clocked out an hour later. Walking to my car in the parking lot, I felt really uneasy. I knew they had left, but it was just concerning that the same car came by 2 nights in a row for seemingly no reason. I drove home and got some rest. Having a lot of schoolwork to do, I decided to take off the next night, so I didn't return to work until the following night. The whole time I was inside cleaning, I had this anxious feeling that made me constantly look out the windows, expecting that car to come back at any point. But I never saw them pull in. I was inside for nearly 3 hours and finished everything I had to do. And not having seen the car come by this night, I felt like maybe it really was all nothing. I packed my stuff up and headed out, locking the door behind me. As I walked through the parking lot, that anxious and uneasy feeling rushed back to me. It felt like I suddenly got a burst of adrenaline, making me sweat and look in all directions. Then, as I was halfway across and standing out in the open, my eyes spotted a car sitting in the far back of the parking lot, away from all the street lamps that lit up the area. Within seconds, it started moving, quickly driving toward me. I sprinted to my car, but I could hear their tires skidding on the pavement as they sped up right beside me and slammed on the brakes. I stumbled forward, thinking they were about to hit me. I was only a few feet away from my car at this point, and suddenly the doors of their car swung open. I didn't even turn my head to look, having my focus completely on getting into my car. Footsteps rushed behind me just as I opened my car and got in. Through the windows, I saw 3 men wearing masks and hoodies sprinting up to me. My hands were shaking as I tried to get my car to turn on. The men started banging on the windows and trying to get the doors open, but I barely got it in drive and drove past them. I got out of the parking lot and onto the road, and from there, I was safe. I called 911 and pulled into a well-lit gas station nearby to wait for them. Unfortunately, the outside of our shop didn't have any cameras, so the information the police had to go off of was minimal. I couldn't even see any of the men's faces. After that night, it's no surprise that I never saw the car or the men again. It was mid-January and it was snowing every day here. I work from home, thankfully, so I didn't have to deal with the awful weather too much, aside from going to the grocery store and whatnot. Some of the days it was pretty bad, with heavy snowfall and gusts of wind. This day, I was in Zoom meetings all day for work, but my connection was really poor and not making for the best experience. Around 6, my connection had cut out completely, and I ended up just having to call it a night from work. The sun had already set by then, but I took my dog outside to use the bathroom really quick. The wind was so cold, it was painful. But while I was out there, I noticed a person standing near the road. They were just standing there, not doing anything, which is fine, but also strange in this kind of weather. I didn't stay out there long enough to really think about it, though. I hurried inside and warmed up, drying my dog's paws off and bundling up under some blankets on the couch. I turned on the news to play in the background, just in case there were any major updates or possible blizzards coming in. Only a few minutes went by when my dog suddenly perked up, and a few moments later began growling at the front door. I didn't have any curtains open, so I couldn't see outside. I got up and walked over to the door. There was a guy walking around outside my front patio. I could see their shoe prints in the snow, going back and forth, as if they'd been walking around for a couple minutes already. He went back and forth again, before walking to the side of the house and disappearing. After a minute, I went back to the couch. My dog, Gracie, was laying down again and didn't seem alarmed anymore. I wasn't really sure what to think about that guy walking around outside my house. It was odd for sure, but enough to call the police over. Probably not. I just kept an eye on Gracie to see if she heard him again. The rest of that night, though, there wasn't anything else. I took Gracie out one more time around 10, and it was even colder and snowy outside, so surely nobody could be out here anymore. I then went upstairs to my bedroom and got ready, then hopped in bed and fell asleep. Actually, I'm not really sure if I'd fallen asleep yet, or was just about to, but I remember opening my eyes to seeing Gracie standing at the bedroom door. She was just staring at the door, head perked up and tail under her legs. I whispered her name, trying to call her over, but she didn't move. Gracie had always been nervous about strangers, but she'd never acted like this inside our home, so I knew something was up. I threw the covers off me and got out of bed, quietly walking to the door and putting my ear against it to listen. I don't know what I expected to hear, but it was quiet. I put my hand on the doorknob, about to unlock and open it, when someone on the other side twisted the handle. I stared in fear as it slowly moved back and forth. Someone was on the other side trying to open the door, and I was just moments away from unlocking it. I could feel my heart pacing faster, and at first I tried to stay quiet, but as the person started to get more aggressive with trying to open the door, I realized they already knew I was in that room. I ran to the bed, getting my phone and dialing 911 as I tried to look for some kind of weapon to defend myself with. It seemed like after I started moving around though, the person fell quiet, not trying to open the door and not moving in the hallway. Still, I grabbed my clothing iron from the closet and proceeded to tell the operator that I needed help. I want to say I waited 10 minutes for cops to arrive. They came in and found no one else inside. The front door was wide open though, probably lockpicked, and snowy boot prints were all over the hallways. They had no intent on stealing anything. They were just looking for me. Unfortunately, that's where the trail ends. The guy came and left with no other traces. I don't think I'd even be able to sleep at night if not for Gracie watching my back. It was the day before Christmas Eve. I had hopped in my car to do a few DoorDash deliveries, hoping the holiday season would bring in some better tips. It was around 11 p.m. when I got this order. It was a normal one, just a bag of food to drop off at their house. Most of my previous orders were actually grocery deliveries, probably because stores would be closing up for the next 2 days. The address on this one was far though. Farther than I'd usually be willing to drive, but with not many other orders coming through, I took it anyway. It was lightly snowing outside, and the roads were very quiet, making the drive peaceful. The house was not in an average neighborhood though. When I pulled up to what I thought was going to be the entrance to the neighborhood, it was actually just a thin path through the trees, with a small cabin-looking home at the end. I pulled down and parked, getting out with the food. I walked up to the door and gave it a few knocks. Inside, I could hear chatter, like a group of people laughing and talking over each other. It sounded like so many people, I was actually confused on how they could all fit in such a small cabin. There was also something strange about the way it sounded that just didn't seem right. Something was off. Then the door opened. A man stood in front of me, and the contrast to what I expected had me put off for a second. The inside of the house was still, motionless. Nobody was running around, and most of the lights weren't even on. And yet, the sound of a huge holiday party was coming from the small room at the end of the hallways. The man smiled at me. "Why don't you come bring the food inside? They'll be happy to see you." That was an odd thing to say. I began stuttering, trying to say no and make up an excuse, but the man interrupted. "They just want to thank you for working during the holidays. You'll be glad you stopped by." All the while he was saying these strange and honestly creepy things, the chatter in the back of the cabin continued, until it suddenly cut out. Just like that, the cabin was quiet. It was like a recording or tape had stopped playing. The man looked back for a moment, clearly not expecting that to happen, and before he could do anything, it dropped the bag on the porch and ran back to my car. I got in and drove away. I stopped doing deliveries for the night and just stayed home for the rest of the holidays. I know nothing actually happened at that cabin, but it's how disturbingly strange everything was, and the thought of what could have happened that still freaks me out. It was the day after Christmas, and I worked at a small family-owned grocery store as an overnight stocker. I'm not even sure why I was scheduled this night, because we were closed for Christmas, and it was probably really slow during the day, so there wasn't much for me to do as far as stocking. I spent the first hour filling what little needed to be filled on the shelves, but then I kinda just wandered around. As I was walking past the front of the store, I noticed a person outside, unusually close to the building for this time of night. It looked like he was just walking around, but he quickly noticed me looking at him, and instead of going away, he came closer to the window. He didn't say anything or try knocking. He just stared at me. I felt really uneasy and wasn't sure what to do. After a few seconds of him not looking away, I turned and walked away from the window. I guess I was just trying to play it off like I wasn't bothered. That was very strange though, like no normal person acts like that. I waited a few minutes before going back to the front of the store and looking out the window. He was gone. I sighed in relief, then continued walking around the store to pass the time. I was just weaving in and out of the aisles, fixing up some of the shelves. Maybe 10 minutes had passed when I rounded the corner at the end of one of the aisles and immediately stopped walking. There were several boxes that had fallen off the shelves and were scattered on the floor. They weren't small things either that could have just tipped over. They had to have been knocked down or moved by someone. Just as I was trying to process it, I heard something from down the aisle. A soft but deep and eerie laugh, like a man quietly laughing right around the end of the aisle. It almost sounded unnatural, like a grown adult giggling like a child. Part of me thought about going to confront him, but when I remembered the man I saw by the window, they were fairly big and could have had something hidden in their jacket. I ran to the front and out the doors, getting in my car and calling the police. They pulled in 10 minutes later, and the man inside the store was gone. We later got hold of the security tapes and saw him find a way in through a side door, and as he hid behind the aisle, laughing at me, he held a knife in his hand, some kind of small switchblade. Cops think he wasn't sober, and I don't disagree, but I also don't think it changes anything. I could have died that night if things had gone any differently. I worked at a gas station for 2 years, starting in 2015. During the winter on my first year, I had a regular customer come in a lot. I worked night shifts, so whenever anyone came in more than once, I'd usually recognize them. This guy was a trucker who told me his name was Paul. He was a really nice guy, though he definitely had something different about him. He was always smiley, like too smiley and happy, especially for it being the middle of the night. Sometimes I actually found it creepy. Anyway, one night he came in and he was acting differently. He walked in and greeted me, but as he looked around the aisles, his face was dull and almost angry. He picked out an energy drink, then came up to the counter, and his face suddenly changed back to that overly happy look. I could see dread in his eyes though, making his smile seem even more fake and almost disturbing in a way. He paid and walked out to his truck, then drove off. I'd almost forgotten about it until the next day when I saw his truck pull in again. It was pretty cold and snowy outside. When Paul came in, he had that same look as yesterday, except he didn't smile at all. He grabbed the first drink on the shelf and came up to the counter. As he paid, he started asking me questions, like how busy it was tonight and when my shift was over. Then, before he left, he asked if I wouldn't mind helping him lift something in his truck. Having known him for so long now, I agreed, wanting to be helpful, and put on my jacket and followed him outside. The gas station was empty, aside from his truck, parked on the far side of the lot. I followed him over there, and he opened the passenger door, then walked around to the driver's side and got in. He said it was right up here, gesturing for me to get in as well. I climbed up and sat down. It was one of those big box trucks that had a door behind the seats for access to the cargo section. I looked at Paul. He had that strange, wide smile again. "It's just right in there. I'll follow behind you." He pointed at the door. I suddenly felt very unsettled and could sense that this wasn't what he said it was. I sat there, trying to figure out what to say or do, and I began to notice an odor. It was strong and disgusting, coming from whatever the hell was behind that door. I looked back up at Paul. His face was tense, but he held that smile and just watched me, waiting for me to move. I jumped back out of the truck, slamming the door behind me and hurrying back into the station. He didn't follow. As I was hurrying back though, I thought I heard him yell, like a frustrated yell coming from the truck. The wind covered most of the sound. He pulled out of the gas station soon after. I worked there for another year, and Paul never showed up again, not even once. I don't know what was back there, or what was really going on with Paul, but I think I was lucky to not have to find out. My name is Trevor, and I'm a freshman in college. I don't have a lot of bills to pay, as I'm lucky to have a supportive family. However, I still have to pay for my own food, and for whatever random activities that I want to do with my friends. I do Uber Eats every once in a while, just to make enough to afford these things. I drove an old beater Honda Accord that probably belonged in the scrapyard, but it did the job, I guess. Anyway, I had been delivering for a couple hours on this day, and it was about 10 p.m. when I picked up an order from Wendy's. There was nothing abnormal about it, at least from what I knew. I drove 15 minutes down the mostly empty highway. The turn was directly off the highway on some gravel road. It was in a forest, and without any streetlights, it was very dark. The headlights on my Honda were really dim too, which made it really difficult to drive down this road. All I could see was about 10 feet ahead. After a minute, the road stopped very suddenly. I checked my Uber Eats app, and it showed that I'd arrived. However, I didn't see a house anywhere. I stepped out of my car and took a few steps in front of my headlights, trying to see if there was a path or something. I didn't see anything. It was just woods and trees. I started to wonder if maybe I had missed a turn somewhere along the gravel road. I turned back around and opened my car door, but as I was getting in, I spotted a light in the woods. It was just a small, dim light coming from between the trees. It wasn't moving at all, which made me think it might be a porch light. I walked a little bit closer to try and see, but it wasn't bright enough to show anything around it. Literally all I could see was the light itself. I stood there for a minute, awkwardly holding the Wendy's bag and unsure whether or not to walk up to it. Then it suddenly moved. It went behind one of the trees and either turned off or just stayed behind it, because it never showed back up. I was definitely unnerved, like if this was the guy who ordered it, then what was he doing? I took a few steps back toward my car, and that's when I heard leaves crunching from directly in front of me. I could hear it getting closer, but still saw nothing aside from empty darkness among the trees. I dropped the bag and got in my car. It took my stupid old car way too long to start, but when it finally did, I made a three-point turn and began driving back down the gravel road. As I did, I caught a glimpse of a man in the side of my headlights, sprinting through the woods and right at the road, clearly trying to cut me off. I luckily made it past him before he got in front of me, because I honestly don't think my car would have been able to stop or swerve out of the way. The rest of that gravel road, it was eerily quiet. When I got back to the highway, I ended my shift and went straight back home. I looked up that area on Google Maps, and there were absolutely zero houses there. It was just some abandoned gravel road with a dead end. I don't know what I was in the middle of, or how many people were in the woods around me, but I know I'm lucky to have gotten away.